Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to be here. I've got double whammy going against me. I had a great panel before me, so very enlightening. And then on top of that, it's also the post-lunch session, so energy levels drop a little bit. So I'm going to try and make this as interesting and as short and as brief as possible. So sexual harassment at the workplace, DEI, what's the connection? Well, I'll try and kind of make one for all of you today. But before that, I want to start with the story that I think many of you are familiar with. It's the story of a company that totally revolutionized the transportation industry. Went places, raised a lot of money. Suddenly, everybody was talking about them. They were fueled by a high-energy CEO who was hell-bent on sort of changing the world before he turned 40. And everything was going well for this company until a single post brought them down, or rather brought him down. The company still survived and thrived. The single post on sexual harassment. And this post basically talked about how the culture at this company was toxic and how she had repeatedly tried to raise issues of sexual harassment at the workplace, but to no avail. The answer she was given was, well, in this company, you know what? These guys are call the shots. You may or may not like to hear what they have to say, or what they do, but you have to put up with it because that's the way the organization is. And this post went completely viral to the extent that the company had to ultimately form sort of a panel. They had to outsource it to a law firm to conduct an inquiry and all of that stuff. And what came out of it was that while the CEO himself had not sexually harassed anybody, but the culture that he had created was a toxic one. And that is really what ultimately led to his downfall. Of course, I think most of you have guessed the name of the company by now. It's Uber. And Travis Kalanick, the founder, no less. It's not like a senior official of the company or anybody else. It's the founder himself who found himself in a situation where his continuance in the organization became untenable. And that is really the world in which we're living in, right? Travis had to step down. And of course, Uber had to completely revamp its entire processes, systems, policies, all of that. What has become increasingly clear now is that globally and in India, both organizations are moving towards a sort of a more of a culture that is inclusive, right? And the word that is, or the term that's acquired currency, and you've heard it on the panel, you'll be hearing it a lot of times in the coming years, is DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does it really mean? Diversity, of course, as you all know, means having more people from different backgrounds, right, in the organization, not just one type of people. It could be gender, it could be any of the other elements as well. Equity, it's a new word, and it's not to be confused with shares or stocks, not to be confused with equality either. Equity essentially means fairness, treating all your employees fairly. And of course, inclusion. Inclusion is probably a really important part of it because you can hire a very, very diverse workforce. But until and unless your policies are drafted in a manner that you can, that can actually involve them and integrate them with your organization, the best laid plans go to waste, right? So what is the connect with sexual harassment? Globally, studies have shown that there are many factors, but two things that play an important role in a culture at a workplace that leads to greater sexual harassment. One is a skewed gender ratio, typically, where your gender ratio, typically males tend to be significantly higher. And that is identified by studies as one of the top reasons for, culture that perpetuates sexual harassment. And the other is the organizational tolerance for behavior that is inappropriate, right? And it is really small things that contribute to it. But ultimately, if you have an organization that is a lot more tolerant about all of these things, like Uber found out, or like Travis Kalanick found out to his peril, then even no matter how great your product is, or no matter how great your services or what your brand is, ultimately it will not stand. It will collapse like a house of cards. So studies now show that companies with less diversity definitely have higher rates of sexual harassment at the workplace. And the issue arises when you have what is called a dominant group of people, right? In a certain context, it could be, let's say, men. It could also be different people from the same ethnicity or the same sort of socioeconomic background, what have you. You can, the way sexuality, for example, all of those factors are now being seen as, we don't want workplaces that are too homogeneous, that are too alike, right? We want workplaces that are diverse, right? And a diverse workplace is one where creativity also thrives, because you've got different people with different ideas, different backgrounds. All of that makes a significant impact when you're looking at sort of workplace diversity. So companies now have to rethink the problem of workplace sexual harassment and understand that fundamentally it is about culture, right? So one of the key elements that organizations are now putting in place, and if they don't have it, they need to have, is what we call the speak up culture, right? So that is part of also creating a culture around inclusion, where people at the workplace no longer feel the fear of retribution in terms of speaking up. A speak up culture ensures that people feel emboldened, they feel protected. They know that if I raise an issue, it will not be brushed under the carpet. I will not be told that, hey, this is not the way we do things here. It will be heard, it will be processed, and maybe appropriate redressal will also be given. The key to a speak up culture, which now organizations are realizing, is this: it's not just about sexual harassment. It is also about compliance, right? A speak up culture, which also translates into a very effective whistleblowing mechanism, is one where you can have people raise issues of maybe compliance, code of conduct breaches, regulatory breaches internally within the organization before it goes on to become or snowballs into a major issue. So sexual harassment is one piece, but if you look at it from a larger perspective today, every organization needs to build a culture where people feel confident and comfortable to speak up, right? So therefore, the employee should feel respected, empowered, irrespective of any sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. All of these things no longer matter. What really matters is a very, very wide mix of people coming together and realizing that we have to take the company forward, irrespective of groupings or individuals. The common objective is take the company forward. And the only way to do that is to have a transparent culture where people are given the confidence to speak up. What this does is, so let's take an example, where of a company where the culture is insular and they don't really encourage people to speak up. Harassment cases will happen. People will not raise a complaint because they know that if they raise the complaint, it will not be heard, will not be processed. And in turn, that perpetuates itself into further harassers becoming more emboldened to carry out greater acts of harassment, and so on and so forth. And all of that is a vicious cycle that is never ending. And that is the reason why the greater lot of organizations invest in DE&I, because if you infuse that into your culture, you will find that not just sexual harassment, but again, all kinds of compliance related aspects also are protected and covered. So a small example of how creating an inclusive culture can go a long way in stamping out sexual harassment at the workplace. An inclusive culture will not tolerate crude sexist jokes, innuendos, homophobic comments, crude humor directed at persons with disability. All of that are stepping stones to a toxic workplace. The minute you put in place a culture where you say that we have zero tolerance or very, very low tolerance for any of this kind of behavior, you're immediately going to see a change at the workplace. All of this cannot happen, and I think the panel before me also said pretty much the same thing. All of this cannot happen without buy-in from the top. You need at the very level, at the very highest level, CEOs, CXOs, to not just sort of pay lip service to it, but to walk the talk, to actually live, breathe, and imbibe that, because it is not just an HR aspect anymore. It is something that the entire company as a whole needs to sort of go and build as a culture, because that's the only way the organization is going to grow. Ultimately, most or all organizations are about people. And the more you invest in people, the more the rewards will be. So building a diverse and inclusive workplace is no longer an HR issue. It is something that the entire organization needs to take along, and with buy-in from CEOs at the very highest level. So that is just my 2 cents. I realize that we are on a short clock, so I'm going to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I mean, you've pointed out a lot of important points, part of this conversation. So we have 20 minutes. I'll fit in some questions that I have for you. I mean, there's an essential dichotomy. I tell you what I mean to say is you have firewalled your organizational culture about, D&I and inclusivity and all of that. But when you step out, you are living in a society that is so-called male dominant. It has own biases. How do you stop those biases from seeping into your office culture? Because the person is traversing between two different cultures. Inside, there's an entire piece, and outside, he's in a different piece. Do we take this into context when we develop these, D&I policies and inclusiveness?
Very good question, Rohil. So I'm going to say something that's probably going to sound a little way out, but I'll say it anyway. So you're right. Right? The environment that corporates are creating today is one of zero tolerance for any kind of misdemeanor, sexual harassment, lack of inclusivity, etc. Right? So if you are joining an organization, you have to be ready to live in that world and behave yourself. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself quickly out of a job. But to answer your question, what does a person do? Because we live in a patriarchal world, right? So people are used to a certain way of living at home, and then suddenly you find that when you come to the workplace, there is talk of equality and inclusion and all of that. So our belief, both my personal belief as well as everybody at my organization, is that this is going to be a situation where, because you spend 10, 12, 14 hours at work, your personality will change. The employees are going to start being more inclusive at the workplace, because they realize that at first it may seem odd or strange, but over a period of time, inclusivity becomes part of your DNA, right? You're spending 14 hours a day in the workplace. You can't be somebody else at the workplace. And over time, this is going to seep back into the home, into the personal lives, where individuals are going to be they're going to change. You're going to see that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. But there are very few people who will be able to kind of be schizophrenic and be somebody at home and somebody at work. We believe that once you change the culture at the workplace, it will migrate back into the home, and you'll find that the culture of the country itself starts to change over a period of time.
I mean, how do organizations make it easier for women to report such cases? Because, there's also a culture that's being seen. I was reading about when women finally, try to ignore it and they say men will be men. It was in popular culture also saying all of this. So how do we make it easier for them to go and report and not really get very perturbed and disturbed about it, that they are, now landing up into a bigger problem by reporting the case?
So good question. And I think, we have a law in India to protect against sexual harassment. And that law, the primary response to your question would be that the law guarantees confidentiality. And in most cases, as a combination of a very strong internal committee that's hearing the matter, as well as the fact that it's now drilled into every employee, that cases of sexual harassment are to be kept confidential. You're not even to be discussing it with anybody at the workplace. That, in my personal experience, I've seen it gives a lot of women comfort. It gives them the comfort that their problems will be heard by the committee, it'll be addressed, and justice will be done. all of it within the framework of the organization such that no third party even comes to know about it, much less it going back home and things like that. So yeah, that is the, sort of way I see that happening. A lot of comfort is given from that.
So when men look at these policies, they often point out that it is skewed towards the other gender mostly, I mean, because it's easier to point out and, and then the whole damage is done until you're proven. How can organizations build a culture? Well, men also are taken into account, like somebody can just use it. Like we saw the Me Too cases happening, and then suddenly there were a lot of false accusations. How can that be factored into this policy?
Two things, Rohel. One is that I think the whole false complaints thing is a little blown out of proportion. Yes, it is an insecurity. It's a male insecurity to some extent because this law is new. It protects women, and there is a natural fear that it will be misused, like with other laws as well, similar laws. But in my experience, there are the number of false complaints are microscopic because women are not interested in most women. I'd say 99.9% of the women are not interested in filing a complaint because that genuine complaints are not being filed, much less false complaints. That said, the other aspect that I want to bring out is that most organizations have what we call a gender neutral policy. Now it has to be crafted carefully because it has to also take into account what the POSH law says, which is protecting women from workplace sexual harassment, while at the same time giving opportunity to men who are, or the third gender or anybody else who's sexually harassed. So if the sexual harassment, anti-sexual harassment policy is properly framed, it can address the concerns of everybody and give everybody freedom from any complaints of sexual harassment.
Is there any data that says that these industries have like more vocal people and these other industries are where actually it's muted, I mean, people really don't speak up. Is there anything of that?
There is a lot of data, and there's also, but it's, we are seeing that, and we did a webinar on this recently as well. There's a lot more work to be done with respect to our blue collar workforce. The women who work in factories, they're in far-flung areas. Very often, the person in charge of that factory is the all in all. And if you are not in compliant with what their demands are, you're likely to lose your job. With the white collar workforce, there is a lot of advances that have happened, right? You've seen a lot of change happening. There's, the messaging with respect to the POSH Act has gone out there. So a lot of good work has been done. But where we really need to focus our energies, factories, gig workers, temp workers, those are the areas where there's neglect and there is a lot of abuse of power and sexual harassment that's going unreported. So that's the area. If you ask me to identify, I'd say that's the area we need to focus on.
We have time for a question. If anyone has, we can take one question. Else I will pose in my last question. Anyone having any questions? Okay. So when you look at this conversation, you said that blue collar and, but largely it's an urban kind of a thing, How will this, kind of secure policy trickle down into smaller tier 2, tier 3 workplaces? Is enough being done by the government, by the regulator, by the companies to push this conversation even to remote areas? Has that started happening? We have technology, we have all of those things. Do you think some serious measures are being taken on that front?
Unfortunately, no. The answer is no. Both largely on part of corporate India as well as in part of the appropriate governments. Very recently, there was a case of, I think not recently, about maybe a year ago, a young lady who was brutally raped and murdered after having raised complaints of sexual harassment against a senior and supervisor in the factory. Nothing came of it. The factory did not even have an internal committee, much less, other forms of redressal. So from corporate India's perspective, they need to create, obviously, comply with the law, right? If you're required to have a committee, you have to have the committee. There is no other way. There's no shortcut. You need to comply. The second is messaging. For example, very simple things like in most of these factories, most of the women workforce don't either speak English or Hindi, right? So your messaging, posters, things like that have to be in the local regional language. You have to conduct workshops, trainings in their language. They understand it. Sometimes you may even need to do it only for the women workforce separately because they're simply not comfortable talking about these issues, in front of a larger, in front of men, for example. So that's corporate India definitely needs to do a lot more with respect to the blue collar workforce. And that's the workforce that is quiet. They don't speak up. They don't raise their voice. They're petrified that they lose their job, right? Very often that's the only factory around for 100 miles, right? And very often that one individual is taking care of their whole family, right? So, it's literally survival for them. So corporate India needs to do a lot more in that respect. The government needs to do more. The government needs to constantly audit compliance with the law by all of these organizations. They need to ensure that organizations are training their workforce. They need to ensure that internal committees are in place, not just on paper. People can always file an annual return at the end of the year, but they need to audit it physically at the factory. And if need be, speak to people discreetly, one-on-one, and say, look, are you all okay? Because in this case that I was mentioning in Tamil Nadu, where this young lady was unfortunately brutally raped and murdered, many other women came out subsequently saying that this guy, the supervisor, has a history of sexual harassment, but nobody did anything about it. So there's a lot more that needs to be done, both by the government and by the corporates that have all of these large factories. They really need to invest a lot more to ensure that workplaces are safer for them.
Of course, it's a long way still, definitely, but good things that conversations are happening. A platform like ours is discussing it, and its real impact is being felt across organizations. But thank you, Anthony, for your time, and been great.
Thank you,
talking
Rohit.
to you.
Thank you very much.